Well, hello there, and today's first two pages is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, or if you're in the US, the Sorcerer's Stone by the fabulous J.K. Rowling. Um, I resisted these books so much when they first came out. My wife is a primary school teacher, or was working in a mainstream primary school at the time, and she was reading them to keep up with the kids because they were all over them. I'm thinking, oh, I'm not going to read a silly Harry Potter book. And then and my wife even read the first chapter to me, and I was like, but I'd read two really heavy books. I read Hannibal and Fatherlands, that Thomas Harris and another Harris, I can't remember, um, which were really kind of heavy going. And I thought, I just fancy something a bit light and fluffy. So I thought I'd read the first Harry Potter book, and I devoured the first three books in 10 days. I just read them back to back to back, and got to the point where for the last book I actually queued at midnight with my sister at a Sainsbury to grab the final book off the presses. It was amazing. And I love the stories. I love the books. I read the entire series to my son. So there's a lovely sense of affection there as well. So I'm simply going to mean most of you will know these first two pages, maybe even by heart, but Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, the first two pages. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning it over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursley had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, their greatest fear that was somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister and a good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. Dursley shuddered to think what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they'd never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull grey Tuesday our story starts, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar, a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realise what he'd seen, then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats didn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people around. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes, the get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of those weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in the Grunnings car park, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it hard to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight. And there we go. The first 2 pages of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone / Sorcerer's Stone, depending where on the world you are. Such an incredible series. And reintroduced a lot of young people to reading. My daughter right now, her lockdown project is to read all the books back to back. So she's watched it. She's reading a book, watching a film, reading a book, watching a film, reading a book, watching a film. And that's kind of one of the things she's doing. And that was fantastic. I mean, the Harry Potter, sometimes it's criticized for not being the best English. I don't get that. Actually, I've read all of the books at least twice, and I think they are fantastic. And the way the story grows with the people who were reading them, they get more mature and darker as you go through. Something that Derek Landy did with the Skullduggery Pleasant books, which I did a week or so ago. So I love the Harry Potter series. The films are fantastic. They were brilliantly cast, but the books are so enchanting, so engaging, and really pull no punches when it comes to some of the more difficult things that we have to face in our lives. So there we go, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Thank you very much for watching. If you have found it interesting, please give it a thumbs up, share it with people, subscribe to the channel, because I'm just going to carry on doing these even if no one's watching. Have a fantastic day. Stay safe, stay well, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.